Good evening, Rifters. This is Rifts and Rules, the 5e D&D podcast, where we go through the many 5e books and talk about various rules to enhance your gameplay experience. I'm Nathan, the Dungeon Master of Riftwake.
And I'm Remy, a player on Riftwake and a Dungeon Master myself. And today we're here to talk to you about trains! Choo-choo! So, this may seem somewhat of an odd topic to discuss on a Dungeons & Dragons podcast, but I actually feel it's somewhat relevant to bring up. So, we talked a lot about movement in the past, but transportation in general in Dungeons & Dragons is a pretty expansive, complicated topic. And to be honest, we just decided to split that up into various types of transportation. So, today's focus, as I said, will be trains. So, Nathan, do you believe that there should be trains in a D&D? Well, actually, let's not start with that question. Let me rephrase. What is the purpose of a train?
Well, the purpose of a train is to basically have a form of transport between for 2 points, 2 different locations on a predetermined track. And effectively what it does is allows you to transport many people at a speed much faster than you could on any other thing, since the track is basically designated for only your thing. So lots of people faster than other forms of transport, and well, you can bring a lot of cargo as well.
There you go. So you saved it at the end there. I was going to say, people would only be a small fraction of the actual uses of trains. So cargo is especially the D&D angle that I find to be of interest. So typically when you see a train go by, it's going to be either the short people train or just those massive, 100-car long cargo trains. But in D&D, there are significant limits to the amount of cargo that can be transported via teleportation. It is inarguable that teleportation is the best form of transportation. And we will absolutely do an episode just focused on teleportation in the future. But cargo is a lot harder. There is only a very small area that is able to be teleported. So how, in a D&D world, do you deal with mass cargo transportation? And there aren't really that many great answers. So one potential answer could be something like extra-dimensional spaces, like a bag of holding, but they don't actually hold a significant quantity of material. So if you have a large amount of cargo to transport, how do you do so? And this is also further complicated by the idea of D&D worlds are typically a fuck ton more dangerous than our world, just by a lot. There is monsters, dangerous magic, just assholes with magic. It's just a dangerous world. So if you want there to be these city states, for all intents and purposes, that are just what's the phrase he used? Points of light in the darkness, I believe is how the Dungeon Master's Guide puts it. So if you have these points of light in the darkness, then okay, that's great, but one place cannot do everything themselves. A place can be made self-sufficient, yes, and that's especially true if you do have advantageous magic accessible as well. But one place can't just grow every type of food that exists. It can't have access to all the resources that are out there. So you need some kind of internationalism in order for there to be just that higher standard of living worldwide. So applying that to D&D, though. So now we'll transition back to that original question I asked, or tried to ask a minute ago. What is your thought on trains in D&D?
So personally, I don't like trains because it ruins my setting. Because my setting is more focused towards the swords and magic kind of fantasy. Which, here's the thing, despite that, there are certain things within my world that can actually be considered something tangential to trains. For example, the great elevator in the city of Dren. It is something that isn't exactly the same as a train. It goes up and down. But in theory, it pretty much does the same thing. Since the path to Undren, which is the Undercity, It's a long and arduous one that requires you to travel through many dangerous underground caves. And by that measure, it pretty much does what a train does. It takes a lot of things, cargo, people, so on and so forth, up and down the train system, the elevator shaft to be more accurate, and gets it there in a fast and safe way.
All right, so I'm just curious for my own sake. Do you think that there are trains in D&D?
You mean general D&D?
Yeah, just through the history of D&D, do you think it's ever actually been an official thing?
Maybe. I think so. I hope.
So it actually is something that back in 3.5, in the Eberron setting, which is official part of 5th edition D&D now, magic trains exist. So there was a thing called the Lightning Rail, and there are even maps that you can easily find on the internet just showing that there is an entire network of trains that actually did just go across Eberron. And that actually is also appropriate because, as a reminder, that is the setting that artificers are from. That is the setting where magic tinkerers are extraordinarily more prominent than the rest of the Forgotten Realms. So to have that be a thing anywhere, of course it's Eberron. But that being said, is it something that would fit in your own game? And as is always the case when you are thinking about that more tinkery side of things, that is something that just depends on your own world. But there is actually a little bit of wiggle room. And this is where just physics and mechanics kind of mesh in my brain to think about things. So my understanding, if I am correct, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan, is your caution about the idea of having a train in your world is the fact that it is that more kind of magical tinker tech that is not quite suited to Riftwake, yes?
Exactly. So here's an example of the reason why the elevator works in a more traditional, like fancy ass magical train works is different, because the way that the elevator works is it's very much a rudimentary, very basic kind of cobbled together system. And in any description thus far of the elevator, it's been shown to be this monstrosity of sorts that is kind of like polluted, ugly, and just unpleasant. And that's basically the general kind of level of technology we're going for, that shows anything to be of complex nature, requiring a lot of basically kind tangential, not exactly straightforward magic, and sort of requiring a lot of runes, which makes the entire construction very messy.
Indeed. So the point I want to lead into with this kind of indirect questions I'm asking at you,
yes,
there are many, many ways to do things, as I ramble out about a lot. But to have anything in the world can be high magic or can be less. So I'm actually going to start at the higher magic end for this. So there actually is canonical methods in D&D that an elemental creature can be bound to a ship in order to give it pretty much perpetual motion energy, and that these ships are able to fly and just sail infinitely because an elemental is an infinite creature, basically. Like a fire elemental just is on fire. It's not something that requires fuel as non-magical fire does. I mean, that's just part of how elementals in D&D work. So in that situation then, something like that could very easily just get copy-pasted to the idea of a train. And then you would just have that, okay, you've got a fire elemental that runs the steam engine and voila, you have motion. Or going by the actual canonical version, you've got the lightning rail. So I don't actually know of the mechanics involved in the original lightning rail, but just guessing, honestly, it sounds like it would be then a lightning elemental of some kind that would just be bound to the engine and magnetized to then have a mag rail train. That is a really just high magic version of it, but magnetism is something that just does obviously exist in the real world. But considering the fact that in D&D you think of things as magic, but you can just apply good old physics to D&D. So maybe instead of having there be the normal types of rails that are the limiter on a train, you can just have there be a magnetic type of train, whether that is through something like a bound elemental, or whether that is just through some form of consumable magical resource. So this is now where we're going to transition to the lower magic. And that is, instead of having infinite energy to run the trains, what if it's finite? And that is also something that I find to be the more fun angle, in all honesty, because magic is generally an infinite resource in D&D. It doesn't matter unless there's an anti-magic field in an area, then a caster will always be able to cast cantrips. There's always some amount of magic working. But if you have some form of magical resource, like arcane shards, as an example, as Riftwake does, then you have a consumable resource that people want. Then that creates that kind of situation of, oh, there's this thing that's very useful and potentially very powerful and also potentially very valuable. And then that would make these trains targets. So there's so many things that can tie up nicely.
So, like, one really fun thing that I have in Riftwake that I've not really brought up thus far is that, in truth, all magic is relatively finite in a way. So, any magic that a person is using typically is taken from their own, life force. It's just how they express it, and that's how people who are more experienced are able to cast more spells because they have better control, and so on and so forth. So, the big fun thing about the elevator in Riftwake is, since it's such a relatively complex machine compared to its the other stuff in Riftwake, to power it, it takes hours, and you just need to dump a whole fuck ton of arcane crystals to get the thing moving. And that's how it works. It gobbles up arcane shards by the thousands to bring more arcane shards up to the surface. And yeah.
So then in Riftwake, all it would take is one inventive dwarf then to just think, what if we had one of these that went sideways?
Exactly. So then you have a more traditional train.
So to throw out, so we've talked about just some of the logistical benefits behind the idea of a train. So now let's actually talk more about the actual story angle of things. It is a classic trope that there is a train robbery where there is either an important person on board the train or there's something valuable like, bonds or something that someone's trying to steal. If you have a train with finite resource, especially in a D&D game, this creates an entire new angle of plot lines that you as the DM then have access to. So you can have that classic train robbery, and then you can have PCs on horses trying to catch up to the train to either rob it themselves or to stop a theft from occurring. And besides that, you then have the idea of, oh no, what if someone tries to destroy the rails of the train? Which, again, in any D&D low to high magic world, it would be really easy to do. Then there would be guards on the train. So that would also give you the escort mission angle as potential storyline.
Okay, so one thing that is quite interesting about trains is essentially think of them as disconnected from help, because they are, while moving between cities, they are miles away from anything that they could get for help. And in that case, they are quite similar to how airplanes are, where whatever happens on the train needs to be dealt with on the train until you can reach a point where you actually can get help. And that creates interesting situations where, well, you can't get reinforcements, so you can't just go to the city guard for help. You need to deal with what's happening on the train right then and right now. And since you have no way to communicate yet, with it's not easy to communicate with people depending on the world. Even if you can communicate with people, it might be difficult to get someone there in sufficient number to help out. So when it comes down to it, what happens on the train has to be fixed on the train, and that's always an interesting aspect that needs to be dealt with, specifically because it's a train.
Indeed. And there is a lot of really good fiction out there that can be used for inspiration just because the train is an enclosed environment. It makes a great setting for just a short story, is how I would immediately think. So just have a one shot or something based on, Murder on the Orient Express, or have there just be however long you really want it to be. You could even make an entire campaign if you just like the movie Snowpiercer. There are a lot of things out there that are train setting based. So by having that be a thing in D&D, then you're just applying the characters and magic in existence to this enclosed setting. It's the same reason that a lot of people like ship-based, pirate-style games, is that it creates this enclosed setting, which creates a lot of excellent opportunities for character-based interactions with each other. So it gives the DM a reason to have a relatively finite cast of NPCs and gives player characters just a lot of opportunity to just have interactions among themselves with those NPCs that they like, with any enemy NPCs that they do end up, meeting and interacting with. Just there is a lot to be said about the benefits of enclosed space settings.
On top of that, when it comes to train, the thing is that since it's more long haul kind of travel, it means that the train has different areas within it, and there's different places that have different uses. So you have a place for eating, you have a place for resting, there's places for recreation. And the thing is that with all this time and this very limited space, it means that you can really, really get down into the dirt with what these things are and really explore the kind of things that you can do there. And basically cement the location within the player's minds as something unique. And that's something really huge for me, as I'm an inside out kind of DM. And it just adds towards that sort of feeling of immersion and fantasy within your world.
Well said. You absolutely have a point there. One of the other benefits of such an enclosed setting is that it gives descriptive DMs an excellent opportunity to really explore that limited setting in depth, to adequately describe just the feel, the layout, just all of the details that DMs like you love to explore and show to players, that having this smaller space gives you that perfect reason to do so in more detail. Also, one other point that I probably should have mentioned earlier, just talking about why train good. So one of the other reasons you mentioned actually yourself earlier, passengers. So I do like focusing on the cargo angle of things because international trade, outside in world building, yada yada. Y'all know the drill by now. But thinking about from the passenger side, there are many, many, many DMs that just hate the travel side of D&D, and that they want to focus on the interactions and the main location points in their world, and that the random interactions and random encounters that happen in the middle is the least favorite part of D&D for many, many DMs. I myself am not included amongst this number, but I'm fairly sure that you could count yourself as one, right, Nathan?
I certainly am.
So having a train gives a quote-unquote safe method of travel to just quickly say, yes, you get on the train, 6 days later, you arrive at your destination. And if the players want to do interactions of just chatting with other NPCs on the train to try to make, downtime connections and such, then that gives an excellent opportunity to do that. And just having there be that automatic time of train travel could be an incredibly valuable resource for the sake of downtime, for that, connections, training, thievery, all of the various downtime activities that are listed in the books. Having that just flat out written, just, yes, there is this X time going here to there. There is this X time going there to there. Just having there be automatic downtime could be very useful for the party as a whole, not just, for you as a DM to make the travel easier, but it's honestly kind of a win-win to just have that be a thing. So I'm curious, now that I've gone into a little more of the pros, are you still so anti-train for Riftwake?
Yes. So here's the thing. One major thing about trains for me that still remains true is that they changed the way that the landscape looks, and especially with the way that trains work and would work in Riftwake, is that they would guzzle tons of arcane shards, which certainly wouldn't be something feasible for long distance travel, because all things considered, the distance up and down is relatively safe, relatively short compared to long distance horizontal travel. And on top of that, it doesn't have an easy source of arcane shards like the elevator does in Dren.
So just to, again, play devil's advocate for a moment, do correct me if I'm wrong once again, but was there not an actual fire elemental in Dren that was used as a fuel source for a forge?
So here's the funny thing about elementals in Riftwake. So they don't exactly follow the same rules as traditional elementals. So the way they work is when there's enough of a magical concentration of a certain element, an elemental may be formed. And by that measure, essentially that's what happened. There was an accident and an elemental was formed. So elementals by themselves are creatures that are created through magical means. And henceforth, if they run out of magical energy at some point, though that may be a very, very long time due to the fact that they are created from immense amounts of magical energy of a certain element, they will cease to exist. And that's essentially how they work compared to more traditional elementals. And in which case, if they were to be used in a train of sorts, effectively the same thing would happen. They would run out of energy and die.
I did not know any of that. So thank you, Nathan. So one thing that I also just do want to bring up, because obviously I am a high magic loving DM. I mentioned the whole idea of having there be the massive cargo options available for D&D, for train in D&D. But it can also go that much farther. So we did talk a bit in the Bag of Holding episode that I believe that if extra dimensional spaces exist, that there's no reason that you couldn't make a bigger one. So there are those like standard sized like metal cargo containers in our world. It's like the 40-foot long 8x8 or something like that. Just the massive big cargo containers that go on trains and ships and such. So if you do have just D&D cargo transportation, could also make a lot of sense then to have there be a massive extra dimensional space in a container like that. And
Remy,
then yes.
Imagine the destruction if that got destroyed.
Yes. So, to be honest, it's probably not as extreme as you would imagine, just because it is the canonical rule that any extra dimensional space in extra dimensional space items create a 10-foot rift into the astral sea. So even a bigger container, in theory, would not exponentially scale the destructive portal creation by rules as written. If you as a DM want to have that trade-off, if you as a DM want to have that trade-off be that if you have a larger extra-dimensional space, then it creates a larger rip into the astral sea, do it. But in summary, trains are a very useful thing that exist, and there's a reason that they have become such a prominent method of transportation for people and cargo in our world. So if you want to import that into D&D, however, is a question of, is it something that you stylistically feel suits your world? And is it something that you feel would add just convenience or just that extra cool factor for their use?
Thanks for listening to this episode of Rifts and Rules. Please leave us a review and give us 5 stars on iTunes. Also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/riftwakepodcast. Tier starters loads $1, and even that much really helps us out. Supporters get benefits such as behind-the-scenes content, early access to episodes, access to the Patreon Discord where you'll be able to chat with cast, and even a shout-out on the show. Find us on social media on Twitter at riftwakepodcast, on Facebook as riftwake, and on Reddit on the subreddit r/riftwakepodcast. And now, send us an email, riftsandrules@gmail.com.
That's riftsandrules@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Bye.